our last but not least, our last speaker today will be Professor Coleman, and he will be presenting his commentary on affirmative action. Please welcome Professor Coleman.
I teach in this room every morning at 8:20, and I sit this way on this desk, so I wouldn't feel right if I didn't sit here. And I always begin my class by asking if there are any questions, but I won't do that this time. Okay, so I'm going to talk about sort of a project that I have thought a lot about, but haven't written about. And it relates to affirmative action, but what I wanted to do was to think about kind of what affirmative action would have meant at the time that the country was founded, with respect to public education. I think there's a difference between public education and then all other types of affirmative action, employment, government contracts, and so forth. I think the rationale for those are different than education. Education, in my view, is predicated upon a notion of diversity. It was in the 18th century. It was called diffusion of knowledge. So I'm going to talk about that, and then I'm going to try to do this quickly enough so that if you have questions, we can talk about it. My goal. Dexter came to me and asked if I would write an article, and I resisted. And then I thought, well, you know, this might be an opportunity to write about diffusion of knowledge, because we're at a period now where the court has the case, and except for the death of Scalia, my guess was that they were going to narrowly limit the Grutter decision, if not outright overturn it. So, because of Justice Scalia's death, I think it kind of opens the issue up again. So I thought, well, this would be a good time to write something about this. And my goal is not to be comprehensive, but to put the idea out there, and then let people kind of think about it. What's interesting is that Scalia, during the argument in the Foster case, made some comments about affirmative action for which he was roundly criticized, talking about the mismatch argument about whether racial minorities were mismatched when they went to top schools and had to struggle. That got a lot of attention. What didn't get as much attention was his dissent in the same-sex marriage case. And you say, well, what does that got to do with affirmative action or diversity? Well, what it has to do with it is that in his dissent, he complained about the fact that the Supreme Court was made up of basically 9 elite judges from very narrow areas of the country, and that there were whole regions of the country not represented on the court. There were law schools not represented on the court. And so he had a rant, as he did sometimes, but he concluded to allow the policy question of same-sex marriage to be considered and resolved by a select patrician highly representative panel of 9 is to violate a principle even more fundamental than no taxation without representation. No social transformation without representation. And I thought, well, that's very interesting because I could agree with that if he would agree that also is a rationale for diversity in higher education. That is, no social transformation without representation. And you can read that a lot of ways. It doesn't happen, or that it shouldn't happen without representation. Okay, so I passed out 2 sheets, and I'm going to sort of explain why, and then I'm going to talk about diffusion of knowledge. So this is the original, so the first page of this is the original design for the seal of the United States. And it was produced by a committee that was appointed on July 4th, 1776, to come up with a seal for the United States that could be adopted by the Congress. The committee was made up of Thomas Jefferson, Benjamin Franklin, and John Adams. Kind of a pretty impressive committee. So what they came up with was this is a drawing done by some person who was helping them with the artwork. It has what became the motto of the United States, E pluribus unum. That was actually adopted in the final seal. But the original drawing for the seal consisted of 6 symbols in the middle that represented the countries. They said the countries from which these states, meaning the 13 original states, have been peopled, right? So people from different European nations. And then around that was the seal of the initials of the 13 states. And the motto, E pluribus unum, which describes an action, the notion that many people are uniting into one, or out of many one. This came from a magazine, a publication, a literary publication called the Gentleman's Magazine. So on the back of the second page of that thing that I handed out, you see the bouquet of flowers, and then E pluribus unum. This was a magazine that was published in London beginning in 1731, and it was well known by people like Jefferson and Benjamin Franklin and John Adams in the 1770s in the United States. The idea of the symbol and of the motto was that a bouquet is made of different flowers where unity and individuality coexisted. And it was not so much a melting pot as we like to talk about. The idea was that you could both have unity and individuality. That was something that the founders focused on a lot, thought about a lot, and they were concerned about how do you turn a country made up of people from so many different countries into the United States, into a democracy, a functioning democracy called the United States. Okay. Affirmative action today is treated sort of like an exception to how people are ordinarily selected for admissions into universities. The idea is that people who are admitted as a result of affirmative action are people who would not otherwise have been admitted, and that they would not be there but for the special efforts that are made, that somehow ignore lesser qualifications, whatever that means, just accept that. And it's justified, this notion of it is justified either because it's necessary to remedy past discrimination or to enrich the education of students who are admitted without affirmative action. That's kind of the offensive view, but that's a widely held view that it makes it better for the people who got in without affirmative action if there are some black folks or some Latinos or whatever there, because then it broadens their education. And then when people are talking about professional schools, they sometimes say that it's important to admit students of color because they then can go out and serve underserved communities. The idea that white lawyers don't go into places where there are potential black clients, so you need to have black lawyers so that they can serve those communities that would be otherwise underserved. So what I wanted to look at was what did the country think about the purpose of higher education before they worried about educating black people, before they worried about the education of people who then were slaves. Sort of the original intent, so to speak. Okay. Every state in the United States has a system of public education. And many of them explicitly say in their constitutions or their statutes that the purpose of the system is the diffusion of knowledge. The Virginia Constitution, for example, declares that government rests, as does all progress, upon the broadest possible diffusion of knowledge, and that the Commonwealth shall avail itself of those talents which nature has sown so liberally among its people by assuring the opportunity for their fullest development by an effective system of education throughout the Commonwealth. Neither Virginia nor any of the other states define what they mean by diffusion of knowledge. So at first blush, the term may appear to be nothing more than the quaint language of another time with no contemporary significance. But the term is neither a relic nor insignificant. It's in its simplicity, diffusion of knowledge identifies both the primary purpose of public education and, as the Virginia Constitution suggests, a fundamental function of democratic government. The link between public education and American democracy was forged at the birth of the nation. As Thomas Jefferson put the point, although the end of democratic government is to secure the rights of individuals, the shield of such rights is the natural powers that flow not from individuals, but from citizens acting as the people. Jefferson's well-known distrust of government was rooted in his belief that all governments are susceptible to corruption. History has shown, he argued, that the best protection a democracy can have against such degeneracy is to illuminate, as far as possible, the minds of the people at large, and more essentially, and more especially to give them knowledge, that they may be enabled to know ambition under all its shades and prompt to exert their natural powers to defeat its purposes. Jefferson put his ultimate faith in public education for enlightenment of the people as a whole or as individuals gathered into a people, the notion of e pluribus unum. This is the diffusion of knowledge that animates public education and sustains democratic government. Moreover, it is the business of the state to effect on a general plan. As envisioned by Jefferson and others, the goal of public education is inclusion, not exclusivity or concentration. While learning is confined to a few people, Benjamin Rush said, where learning is confined to a few people, we always find monarchy, aristocracy, and slavery. To achieve the purpose of public education in a democratic society, a primary function of the general plan of government must be removal of obstacles to the broad diffusion of knowledge. In his time, for example, Jefferson believed that the principal such obstacle was poverty. Consistent with that, he proposed a public education system for Virginia that had as its primary goal education of the poor. Because of its paramount importance, Jefferson assumed that the wealthy would pay for education of their own children. As a result, by his plan, knowledge would be diffused among the people as a whole. Jefferson argued that by eliminating poverty as an obstacle to the diffusion of knowledge, Virginia could claim for its people those talents which nature has sown as liberally among the poor as the rich, but which perish without use if not sought for and cultivated. In 1813, Jefferson summed up his view of the importance of public education in a letter to John Adams, in which he expressed the hope that the public education system someday would be the, quote, keystone of the arc of our government. The broad diffusion of knowledge also serves to assimilate diverse groups of people into a functioning democracy. In discussing his proposal for a national university, George Washington said, quote, the more homogeneous our citizens can be made in these particulars, the greater will be our prospect of permanent union. The diffusion of knowledge seeks to overcome those differences among citizens, such as religion, poverty, and nationality, that inherently threaten democratic self-government. Benjamin Rush argued, for example, that a system of public education was important in Pennsylvania, quote, while our citizens are composed of the natives of so many different kingdoms in Europe, our schools of learning, by producing one general and uniform system of education, will render the mass of the people more homogeneous and therefore fit them more easily for uniform and peaceful government. We now take for granted that education is an important responsibility of government, ranking at the very apex of the function of a state. But we have lost sight of diffusion of knowledge as the goal. Divorced from its purpose, however, public education ceases to perform the democratic function expected of it. The fact is nowhere more apparent than in the country's treatment of the public education of African Americans. The revolutionary leaders also believed public education was intrinsically linked to democratic government, and in mind a society that politically, the revolutionary leaders who believed public education was intrinsically linked to democratic government had in mind a society that was politically homogeneous. Quote, it was a heady vision of a new world in which rich and poor, German and French, Protestant and Catholic, but not black and red, would take part in the great experiment, close quote. As a result, Jefferson and others had no occasion to consider the diffusion of knowledge in a multiracial, multi-ethnic democracy. As James Conant wrote of Jefferson's ideals on public education, one might note in passing an assumption here about the diffusion of talent among the people, which reflects the homogeneity of the white population. The exclusion of Black people from the heady vision of a new world was not inadvertent, but by design and continued long after they formally became citizens. One of the principal characteristics of American slavery was a systematic effort to keep slaves in a state of ignorance. As one defendant of this system crudely explained, quote, "If you teach the Black man how to read, there would be no keeping him. It would forever unfit him to be a slave. He would at once become unmanageable and of no value to his master. As to himself, it would do him no good, but a great deal of harm. It would make him discontented and unhappy." Close quote. Following emancipation of the slaves, white supremacists and other indifferent Americans sought to perpetuate the ignorance of Black people in order to disenfranchise them and to preserve their own exclusive control of government, predicated on race. This likely reflected Jefferson's highly pessimistic view that even after what he considered the inevitable abolition of slavery, quote, "the two races, equally free, cannot live in the same government," close quote. Jefferson explained that the country could not, quote, "retain and incorporate the Blacks into the state because deep-rooted prejudices entertained by the whites, 10,000 recollections by the Blacks of the injustices they have sustained, new provocations, the real distinctions which nature has made, and many other circumstances will divide us into parties and produce convulsions which probably never will end, but except in the extermination of one or the other race. It has been only in the last 30 or 40 years that governments, through race-conscious measures, have made any systematic effort to educate African Americans and other minorities to the full extent of their talents under the same circumstances that the white majority is educated. Many now argue, however, that the time has come to abandon such efforts and to decide whom to educate on the basis of objective merit without consideration of race. But as Jefferson observed, the habits, opinions, and expectations that are the products of our long history of difficult race relations are not so easily overcome. It still is necessary to make a deliberate effort to ensure racial inclusion. More importantly, however, a race-blind allocation of higher education would not spread, quote, "the opportunities and advantages of education in the various parts of the country and among the different orders of the people," close quote. Diffusion of knowledge is not a remedial device. Rather, it is the ultimate goal of public education. A concentration of education in a way that excludes racial and ethnic minorities undermines that goal, whether or not the concentration results from discrimination. No one disputes that excluding African Americans or other minorities from public universities because of their race violates the Constitution. Equally important, it also subverts democracy. In the same way, the race-blind allocation of public education undermines the diffusion of knowledge because it deprives government of the ability to ensure the education of discrete minorities. It thus would lead to a concentration of education among non-minorities, which the state's general plan for public education affirmatively must prevent. Indeed, preventing such concentrations is a fundamental function and a compelling interest of democratic government. The diffusion of knowledge is especially important today in face of ongoing national debates about race-conscious government decisions and the disintegrating effect of the recent immigration of peoples of color. As the country moves inexorably toward a society composed of large blocks of different racial and ethnic and religious minority groups, there is a legitimate concern about balkanization and its effect on our democracy. But race blindness in public education promotes racial and ethnic balkanization, not democracy. It is clear today that race and ethnicity lie at the fault lines of American democracy, along with religion and wealth. In view of that, the wide diffusion of knowledge arguably is even more critical to the preservation of democratic values than it was in the 18th and 19th centuries, when the primary concern of education was education of a racially homogeneous society made up of people from different European nations. As a result of unlinking public education from its purpose, the current debate about race-conscious admissions wrongly assumes that the issue is one of individual rights. It focuses upon the relative objective qualifications of applicants competing for admissions to public universities and gives no consideration to diffusion of knowledge. Those who advocate race-blind admissions argue that race-conscious admissions unfairly prefer less qualified minority applicants over, quote, more qualified, close quote, non-minority applicants. Such preferences, they argue, unlawfully discriminate against the more qualified non-minority applicants in the sense that if all applicants were of the same race, the university would prefer the more qualified non-minority applicant over the less qualified minority applicant. Stated differently, if race is not taken into consideration, the number of minority students enrolled, the number of non-minority students enrolled in public universities theoretically would increase. And this is the rationale for the so-called reverse discrimination litigation. Not that the plaintiff would have been admitted, but that the plaintiff's chances of being admitted would have been increased by whatever the number would be when you exclude minority applicants with lesser qualifications than the plaintiff. Thus, the effect of a race-blind admissions policy would be relatively more concentration of knowledge and consequently less diffusion. Nevertheless, advocates of such a policy argue that admission to public universities should be based on individual merit, which they claim is racially neutral and fair. Even if that were true, it still would miss the point of public education. A race-blind admissions policy elevates individual interests over a fundamentally more important public interest in the diffusion of knowledge, the process for uniting many into one. The implication of such a policy is that the state has no legitimate interest in the education of racial minorities, or ethnic minorities, or religious minorities, that if necessary to protect the individual rights of the academically more qualified non-minorities, the state must sacrifice the education of academically less qualified racial minorities. That, in turn, assumes that a multiracial and multi-ethnic democracy can survive with a despotic educational system that concentrates public education among non-minorities. Stripped of its varnish, a race-blind admissions policy directly conflicts with the core purpose of public education. And in a society that increasingly is composed of distinct racial groups, such a policy in the long run undermines democracy. Justice Jefferson argued that government in a racially homogeneous society had an affirmative responsibility to prepare the poor by education for defeating the competition of wealth and birth for public trust. Government today has a responsibility in a multiracial and multi-ethnic and multi-religious society to prepare its minorities by education for defeating the competition of non-minorities for public trust. That is the essence of democracy. Indeed, ensuring the diffusion of knowledge among the people as a whole must be a threshold consideration of public education, not a sideshow. For that reason, it is imperative to acknowledge formally the link between public education and the diffusion of knowledge. Okay, so that's all of that. That's kind of the overview of my point. As I said, the way we defend diversity is by reference to past discrimination or, the impact that it will have on, the people who otherwise would not be educated with minority groups, people from minority groups, or the notion that somehow, you have to have black lawyers because that may be the only way that some black people will have legal representation. I think that all of those are traps, and the last two, I think, are offensive. I think that it is much more legitimate to defend what I call diffusion of knowledge on the basis of the purpose of public education than on the basis of some artificial arguments that have a contemporary origin. And that ignores what the original purpose and I think the continuing purpose of public education was. In 2003, when the Grutter case was being litigated, the American Bar Association filed an amicus brief. And at the time, I was active in the American Bar Association, so I had some influence over the brief. The brief was prepared by Covington, anyway, I don't have the names of the lawyers, but it was prepared by a New York law firm for the American Bar Association. It was signed by the president of the American Bar Association. And one of the arguments that we made in the brief was this notion of diffusion of knowledge, that was one of the compelling government interests in diversity in higher education. In the opinion that Justice O'Connor wrote, she actually talks about diffusion of knowledge. She doesn't cite to the American Bar Association brief, but she talks about how the court had repeatedly acknowledged the overriding importance of preparing students for work and citizenship. And she said, this court has long recognized that education is the very foundation of good citizenship, and she cites Brown versus Board of Education. And then she says, for this reason, the diffusion of knowledge and opportunity through public institutions of higher education must be accessible to all individuals regardless of race or ethnicity. Which sort of mangles the concept a little bit, but it makes the point, which is that if you're going to attain the goal of public education, it can't be race blind. You've got to look at who you're admitting. Otherwise, it's all by luck. And if it's really an important goal, then you can't leave it to luck. You have to do it directly. That's my argument. That's going to be the paper that I write when I finish it. I have the introduction, as you saw, but that's it. So I'm interested in reactions, questions. What?
We need to think about it a little bit here.
You have to think about it. But think about it. When the only time I've talked about this in the past was in 2001. I was invited to be on a panel to talk about affirmative action at the annual meeting of the Federalist Society in Washington, D.C. And they expected that I was going to come and talk about affirmative action in the way that everybody else was talking about affirmative action. And I decided that I was going to come and talk about diffusion of knowledge. And I did. And they were silent, just like you guys. They thought about it. But when the Supreme Court issued its decision in 2003 in Grutter, they did something really interesting. They put on their website the court's decision, and they put my speech. They linked my speech to it too, because I think that, after thinking about it, they actually thought that there was something to what I was saying. I was going to write about this, a long time ago, but that's not my thing. I'm not really. I'm not a legal scholar, and I would much rather work on cases than work on articles. But I thought that now might be a good time at least to put this out and let people talk about it or take shots at it. Yes.
What is your
You get the mic.
what is your response to people who say that affirmative action, which generally is for protected classes, for based on gender, race, nationality, what is your response to people who say that affirmative or any type of programs should be based on income as opposed to race?
Again, I don't think that actually carries out what the goal of higher education ought to be. You can't simply bring in poor people who are black, poor people who are Latino, poor women, and satisfy this notion of diffusion of knowledge. I mean, I think that the basis on which you bring people into a university may take income into consideration. That's what Jefferson did, right? He wanted to make sure that the poor, but that's not the only basis on which you want to diffuse knowledge. And I think that the object ought to be to bring in people who are going to be capable of becoming leaders, because that ultimately is what it's about, kind of developing leadership in a democratic society. And you're not going to find all of those people among the poor. I don't think you should be limited to poor people. That's just trying to avoid race. That's just trying to avoid taking a look at, the race of people who are being admitted, as if doing that is somehow wrong. And my point is that in a society where, you have identifiable racial groups, and that the tension within the society involves those groups, those are the folks you want to make sure you are educating, and you want to make sure that you know that you're doing that, and not simply take the chance that if you admit a lot of poor people from North Carolina, you're probably going to have some black students.
I'll push back on in the sense that I think a lot of the arguments you were making right now against using income as a primary identifier could also be applied to race, in the sense that if you're attempting to disseminate knowledge, if the goal is the diffusion of knowledge, categorizing everyone by race almost generalizes people in a way that there might be other factors that are also equally or additionally important.
I'm not saying that you categorize everybody by race. I'm just saying that when you are admitting students, you can take race into consideration. I mean, you may admit some people who are black without considering their race. You may admit some poor people because you want to have poor people in your university, and they may also be black. But if you've done that, you also ought to be able to look at the class that you're admitting, and to ensure yourself that you have some critical mass of some group that that is important in your state. In South Carolina, for example, the University of South Carolina that is 99% white, in a state that's 20-some, 30% black, I think that that's a system of higher education that in the long run will fail. It won't be supported by the people, and it's not educating people who are necessary to make the society work. And this notion that, well, you can just send them to the Charleston Creek College, and that'll be okay, they'll get an education. I mean, exactly the point that Scalia made. If you're going to have social transformation, you got to have representation. And, the idea that people from the University of South Carolina are going to learn something from the people who went to Charleston Creek College, if they ever run into them, that's not going to work. And I don't think that, University of South Carolina would take that chance, or should take that chance. I'm not saying that everybody ought to be admitted on the basis of a race. That's not how it would work. But you want to be able to look to see who's being admitted, so that if you are not admitting people from some background that you think is important for the diffusion of knowledge, you ought to be able to do that and not have to play games and say, well, we'll just call it poverty in order to avoid calling it race. In the end, your goal is for racial diversity.
Is there a hierarchy to the factors that you would look at then? I mean, because in some...
You want the best qualified people you can admit. Sure. So you're always going to do that. I mean, Jefferson called it raking the geniuses from the rubbish or something like that. The idea is that, you get the best students capable of learning, and those are the ones that you admit to the university. He wasn't saying that you have to, that everybody has to, you admit the first 100, scores on the SAT, or, he was saying you admit, students from all of the counties across Virginia, based on, their ability to be educated. And I think that would be the case. I mean, I don't think you just, bring in people you think won't be able to learn.
So I'm just making sure that I understand. You're talking about economic diversity or poverty, to not use it as a placeholder for race, but you're not saying that don't look at economic diversity.
No. I said that. Okay. No. I think that you would also admit poor students. I mean, and my point was that was the original idea of the Jefferson Plan in Virginia, was so that they would educate poor people. And I think that's still, that still should be a goal. But I think that you should also, there are other groups in a society who are going to be necessary to make the society work. And that was the whole point of higher education, was it had a democratic purpose, which was to make the society work, out of many one. And I think that still, and if you look at what's going on today politically, I mean, there's more need for it today than ever. Given the way the society may be pulling apart along those lines. Yes.
This is a continuation, actually, of a conversation. But what do you say to people who challenge the need for affirmative action by saying that racism is over? There are not the same amount, there's not the same level of racism that there was in the 60s and 70s. There are actually little phrases now, gay is the new black, orange is the new black, literally to mean that there's actually like, we have a black president, there's no need for affirmative action, race-based affirmative action.
See, I wouldn't call it affirmative action, number one, because that suggests that it is something that is different than what you're doing when you're admitting to people. This notion that there's no racism, let's assume that we were at a place where there was no racism. It wouldn't matter. You would still want diffusion of knowledge. So it's not dependent on past discrimination. If there had never been past discrimination, you would still want diffusion of knowledge. I mean, why wouldn't you? Right? Because that's where the tensions if they develop, they would develop along, and we know this through history, they would develop along racial lines, religious lines, you know. And as things get difficult, that's when societies pull apart. So the idea that George Washington had for a national university was that it would be the guarantee against that you would bring people from different parts of the country, from different countries, and they would be educated together and they would get to know each other. And that would be the insurance against disintegration.
So if there's no racial discrimination at play, and let's say this is Duke, this is Harvard, and people of color, women are applying, and they just get in, then what would be the basis of having, in addition to that, a particular mechanism to ensure that those same groups?
Well, if you don't have to do anything other than just admit people on whatever criteria you use, and you are satisfied when you do that, that you have diffusion of knowledge or diversity, then that's all you need to do. What I'm talking about is in a situation, if you look in Texas, right? So they have this thing now that, the top 10 students in every high school get to go to the University of Texas. And what's happened is that people, that's been the best thing for integration of their high schools, right? So people say, well, I'll go to, Jefferson High School and I'll be one of the top students and I'll graduate that way. So it defeated the idea that you could have diversity that way because of the segregated schools. All of a sudden, the schools are now integrated, right? So, so if that's what happens, then you do exactly what Texas said it had to do. It had to now look at race because otherwise, when it relied on, just top high school students graduating, at a time when they thought that they would always be segregated, all of a sudden they're not segregated. So then you're not getting black students who otherwise would have graduated at the top of their class. So you would have to, make adjustments depending on kind of what's happening each year. Some years maybe you don't need to do anything. You have a diverse class and you've served your purpose. Other years you might.
I guess I'm mixing up like the need for affirmative action versus when you have affirmative action and the impact. So I guess I'm looking at the diffusion of knowledge as like the impact of affirmative action, like when you have it and then
the diffusion of knowledge is the idea that when you admit students in a way that will diffuse knowledge, meaning that the people admitted will be from diverse backgrounds and diverse groups, racial, ethnic, whatever. Okay, that's a concept. In other words, diffusion of knowledge was the notion of diversity. That was the goal. The goal was diffusion of knowledge, and so that's what they did. They went out. Dickinson University was established for that purpose. And the reason to look at it this way is because if you take race out of the picture, then all of a sudden people, you go back and you say, well, what did people do when they weren't talking about race? They did what you would now call affirmative action, right? Except it wasn't based on race; it was based on other things. So all of a sudden, when black people come into the system, then they should have done the same thing. What they did was they excluded them. They didn't include them in the diffusion of knowledge. That was an affirmative. In other words, they were doing exactly opposite of what their Constitution said they were supposed to do. So now what they're doing is they're going back and they're some of them are saying, well, we should be diffusing knowledge. That should be our goal, and so that's what we should be doing. And people are saying, whoa, you can't do that because, now you're admitting people who are not qualified, which simply maintains the concentration of, knowledge. And my argument is that undermines, democratic government. And I think we see it in the country. I think you can see it. Yes.
So I guess if we adopted the diffusion of knowledge kind of principle and started putting that into practice, do universities then, and we talk about critical mass, but is that essentially just proportional representation of what their state population is, or?
Yeah, see, I don't try to work out how you do it. I mean, I just say that universities ought to be able to do it. You know, how many they admit, I mean, I think ultimately that becomes a political question, right? So, you know, if you're not admitting people and all of a sudden, you know, folks down in Charlotte say, well, you're not admitting anybody from Charlotte. And they say, well, that's because all the smart people are in, you know, in Asheville and Greensboro. Well, the people in Charlotte they're not gonna support the public school system, right? They're gonna say, well, we're not gonna pay to educate those people. You know, you should be educating us too. Well, I think the same thing would happen. You know, you look at who's being admitted and who's not being admitted, and the universities will adjust. And I think they'll adjust because of pressure to do that.
To some degree, is that happening in some places?
Sure, I think it happens, yeah. I mean, if you look at private schools, you know, those who aren't constantly worried about being sued under Title VI, you know, that's what they do. They go out and they try to bring in, you know, I mean, Harvard did that. I mean, I went to Harvard because they did that, you know. I'm sure they could have found a lot of white folks to take the position I had. But, you know, they thought that, you know, I might one day be a leader. Maybe they could educate me.
Maybe even a law professor.
Yeah. So, you know, so I think that that's what, you know, schools have done forever. It's just that, you know, they haven't admitted a lot of racial minorities for a lot of different reasons, and having nothing to do with diffusion of knowledge. I mean, you know, sometimes discrimination, sometimes other things.
You mentioned that the idea of diffusion of knowledge is in a bunch of state constitutions. So do you see potential for, on a state level, affirmative
Yes.
litigation for,
Yes.
okay. People
I would. I mean, if the University of North Carolina is all of a sudden not admitting black people, yeah, I mean, I would say that the people who are, you know, I would sue the people who run the university and say that they're not doing their job, that, you know, that their job is what their Constitution says. You know, the Massachusetts Constitution, which was 1780, and I'll just read a part of this. It says, wisdom and knowledge as well as virtue are diffused generally among the body of the people, being necessary for the preservation of their rights and liberties. And as these depend on spreading the opportunities and advantages of education in the various parts of the country and among the different orders of the people, it shall be the duty of legislatures and magistrates in all future periods of this Commonwealth to cherish the interests of literature and the sciences and all seminars of them, especially the university at Cambridge, public schools and grammar schools in the towns. So, you know, that was the idea. I mean, obviously they were talking about Harvard. So, you know, the idea is that, you know, back 1780, Constitution required them to do that among, you know, the different orders of people in the various parts of the country.
You might not have the same ability to do that under the U.S. Constitution because
No, I don't think
there's
right.
nothing in there to really.
Exactly.
grasp
The only
on.
thing the U.S. Constitution does is to interfere, you know, and the question would be, the way I would look at the question is whether the 14th Amendment was intended to prevent states from carrying out the provisions of their Constitution. So you would argue maybe even the 11th, what is it, the 11th Amendment? Is that the one everybody talks about? 10th Amendment, whichever one it is. You know, you would argue that, you know, that the states did not delegate to the federal government the ability or the power to prevent them from carrying out diffusion of knowledge. That's how I would litigate it, if I were litigating.
Well, thank you very much. For coming, and again, let's give another round of applause for our speakers.